Stop. Before you keep going, I need you to do something for me. Close your eyes for a second. Actually, don't. You're reading this. But stay with me. Imagine a human being. Not the version Hollywood invented. Not the hunched, grunting, dragging a club across the dirt version that every museum poster and every bad documentary keeps recycling. A real one. A Homo sapiens from 40,000 years ago. Sharp eyes, lean frame, a brain running the exact same software yours is running right now, same anxiety, same curiosity, same instinct to reach for something when stress hits, same biological machinery underneath the animal hide and the dust and the sun. Now picture him waking up one morning and instead of the open grassland, instead of the river and the tree line and the smell of rain on dry earth, he opens his eyes and he is here. Modern world. Your world. He doesn't know what a road is, but he figures out to stay out of the way of cars within about 30 seconds because he is not stupid. He has never been stupid. His entire species survived ice ages, megafauna, starvation, and each other. He walks into a fast food restaurant. He has no framework for what he's looking at. A glowing board on the wall with pictures of food, hundreds of options, things dripping with fat and salt and something sweet underneath it all that his brain has no word for but every nerve ending is screaming about. The smell alone is doing something to him that he cannot explain. He points at something. Someone hands it to him in a bag. He sits down. He eats it. Then he looks at the bag. Then he looks at the board again. Here's where it gets interesting. Not what he thinks about the napkins, not how he reacts to the self-flushing toilet, though honestly that video would break the internet. The real question, the one that actually matters, the one that flips everything you were taught about ancient humans, evolution, and your own body completely upside down. Could he, that perfectly engineered ancient survival machine, that product of millions of years of ruthless biological optimization, end up obese in the modern world? Could he? Because the story we've all absorbed quietly, gradually through school and documentaries and 1,000 casual conversations goes something like this. Ancient humans were lean machines. They were out there every single day, moving, hunting, climbing, sprinting, struggling. They were basically the original fitness influencers, except instead of a gym membership, they had a mammoth to chase, and instead of a protein shake, they had whatever they could pull out of the ground with their bare hands. And we, their modern descendants, are the embarrassing plot twist. Sitting in ergonomic chairs, ordering food through apps, watching other people exercise on screens. The story makes sense. It feels true. It has the satisfying shape of a moral lesson. We got soft. They were hard. End of story. But what if that entire framing is wrong, not slightly off, not missing a few nuances, fundamentally, structurally wrong in a way that changes everything about how you understand your own body and why it does what it does? Let's actually look at this properly. When we talk about ancient humans, we need to be precise because precision matters here. We are not talking about some half-evolved transitional creature squinting at fire like it's magic. We are talking about anatomically modern Homo sapiens, people with the same skull capacity, the same neural architecture, the same hormonal systems, the same digestive biology as every human alive today. These people existed for roughly 300,000 years before agriculture arrived and restructured everything. They were hunter-gatherers. That label sounds simple. It is not simple. Their lives were a relentless, unscheduled, unpredictable negotiation with an environment that owed them absolutely nothing. There was no guaranteed meal. There was no concept of a food supply. There was just today, what can I find? Is it worth the energy to go get it? And will I find something tomorrow? Their diet reflected that chaos completely. Depending on geography, season, climate, and luck, they might be eating large game for several days straight, then nothing, then roots and tubers pulled from dry soil, then fruit when a tree happened to be bearing, then fish, then birds, then insects, which are genuinely an excellent protein source, regardless of how uncomfortable that makes you feel. There was no consistency, there was no routine, there was absolutely no Tuesday pasta night. There was just the relentless present tense of survival. And critically, there were gaps, long ones. Ancient humans did not eat 3 times a day. They did not snack between meals. They ate when something was available, and they did not eat when nothing was available. Sometimes nothing was available for 2 days. Sometimes nothing was available for 2 weeks. That is not a diet strategy. That is not intermittent fasting as a lifestyle choice. That is just what the world looked like before supermarkets and agriculture and the entire infrastructure of guaranteed calories that modern humans swim in without even noticing it. Now here's where the standard story starts quietly falling apart. Most people hear all of that and the conclusion feels obvious. Of course they were lean. Of course they didn't have obesity. They were running around burning enormous energy every day and barely scraping together enough food to function. Classic caloric deficit, mystery solved, except it isn't solved. Because scientists have actually gone and measured this, not estimated, not modeled, not theorized, measured. The Hadza people of northern Tanzania are one of the most studied populations in all of human health research, and for good reason. They are one of the last remaining groups of true hunter-gatherers on Earth. They hunt with bows they make themselves. They forage across enormous distances every single day. Hadza men track animals across open savanna for hours under direct equatorial sun. Hadza women dig tubers from compacted African earth and carry heavy loads back over long distances. Nobody drives, nobody has a desk, nobody sits in a meeting for 3 hours discussing Q3 projections. Their daily physical output is staggering by any modern standard. The average Western adult placed into a Hadza lifestyle would be physically destroyed within a week. So researchers expecting to confirm the obvious strap-precise activity monitors onto Hadza adults and measured their actual total daily energy expenditure with equipment that doesn't rely on self-reporting or estimates. Real numbers, and what they found was not what anyone expected. The total daily calorie burn of Hadza adults was statistically indistinguishable from adults in the United States, the United Kingdom, Japan, and the Netherlands. Read that again, slowly. A Hadza woman who walks miles across the savannah, digs in the earth for food, hauls water, and manages her children in the African heat, burns approximately the same number of calories per day as an American woman who commutes to an office and sits at a computer until evening. Same number. Same total. How is that possible? The answer is called metabolic adaptation, and it is one of the most important and most ignored facts about human biology. The body is not a simple mechanical engine where more movement equals more calories burned in a linear relationship. The body is something far more sophisticated than that. Think of it less like a furnace and more like an extremely intelligent budget manager who has one non-negotiable rule: the total must stay balanced. When the Hadza increase their physical activity, the body doesn't just add those calories burned on top of the baseline, it finds other places to cut spending. The basal metabolic rate, which is the energy your body uses just to keep your heart beating, your lungs inflating, your cells maintaining themselves, quietly drops. The immune system runs a slightly reduced operation. Certain background cellular processes dial back. Hormonal activity adjusts. The result is that the total energy expenditure across the whole day ends up nearly identical whether you walk 12 miles across Tanzania or sat in a chair in Chicago. This is not the body malfunctioning. This is the body doing exactly what 300,000 years of evolution designed it to do, managing a finite energy budget with extreme precision in a world where caloric availability was never guaranteed and waste was never an option. But here is what this finding actually tells us about ancient humans, and this is the part that dismantles the conventional story completely. If the most physically active population alive on Earth today burns the same calories as the most sedentary modern populations, then physical activity was never the primary mechanism keeping ancient humans lean. It was never the main variable. It was never the engine of their metabolic health. The real reason was something far more basic and far less flattering to the exercise industry. They couldn't accumulate enough food, not because they weren't trying. They were trying constantly, desperately, every single day. But the environment simply would not deliver a sustained caloric surplus. And without a sustained caloric surplus maintained over a long enough period, The body cannot accumulate the level of stored fat that defines clinical obesity. Scarcity was the protective mechanism, not virtue, not discipline, not superior genetics, just scarcity, enforced by a world that didn't have a delivery app. Now here is where the biology gets genuinely unsettling, because the picture it paints about the ancient human body is not what most people expect. The ancient human body was not indifferent to fat storage. It was not neutral about caloric accumulation. It was not some clean, pure, naturally restrained system that only stored what it needed and nothing more. The ancient human body was aggressively, relentlessly, enthusiastically oriented toward fat storage. The entire metabolic system was wired with one deep directive. When food is available, store as much energy as possible as fast as possible, because food will not always be available and the gap between feast and famine could be the difference between life and death. This is what the thrifty gene hypothesis describes. First articulated by geneticist James Neal in 1962, the hypothesis proposes that natural selection specifically and deliberately favored individuals who could store energy as fat with maximum efficiency during periods of abundance. Because those individuals, the ones whose bodies grabbed every available calorie and converted it to stored fat immediately, were the ones who survived the inevitable droughts, the harsh winters, the failed hunts, the long gaps between successful foraging. The ones whose bodies were less efficient at fat storage died. Their genes didn't propagate. The efficient storers survived, reproduced, and passed those genes forward. Generation after generation, millennium after millennium, the selection pressure ran in exactly one direction: get better at storing fat, get more efficient at holding on to energy, resist losing it. Every human alive today is a descendant of those efficient storers, every single one. You carry those genes. The ancient humans standing by that river 40,000 years ago carried those genes. The mechanism is biologically identical, which means something important and deeply counterintuitive. The ancient human was not lean because the ancient human's body didn't want to store fat. The body wanted nothing more than to store fat. It was designed from the ground up to pursue that outcome with everything it had. The ancient human was lean because the environment kept winning the argument. The food wasn't there in sufficient quantity, sustained over sufficient time to let the body succeed at what it was desperately trying to do. Scarcity overruled biology. And the moment scarcity disappears, you already know the answer, because you're watching it happen in real time. But let's not just theorize. Let's look at the actual historical evidence, because it exists, it's documented, and it is one of the most striking natural experiments in the entire history of medicine. The Pima people of Arizona have become one of the most referenced populations in obesity research. And the reason is simple. Their story is a controlled experiment that history ran without asking anyone's permission. For thousands of years, the Pima lived in the Sonoran Desert as farmers and foragers. They were lean. They were metabolically healthy. Obesity as a phenomenon simply did not exist among them in any meaningful way. They had adapted across generations to an environment where calories were genuinely difficult to obtain, where the desert demanded constant physical effort and offered limited caloric reward, and where the body had to be efficient because excess was never on the table. Then the late 19th century arrived and changed everything. Not through any choice the Pima made, but through a sequence of external events they had no control over. Upstream settlers diverted the river systems that the Pima had relied on for irrigation for generations. Their traditional farming collapsed almost overnight. The U.S. government intervened with food assistance. The food that arrived was dominated by refined flour, lard, canned goods, and sugar, processed, calorie-dense, stripped of the fiber and complexity and satiety signals that natural food carries. Within 1 to 2 generations, an evolutionary instant so brief it barely registers on any meaningful time scale, the Pima developed some of the highest recorded rates of obesity and type 2 diabetes in any human population ever studied. Researchers were stunned. The rates had no historical precedent. Nothing in the Pima's past suggested this was coming. Their genetics had not changed. Their DNA was identical to what it had been for centuries. Only one thing had changed: the food environment. And then comes the piece of evidence that locks the whole argument in place. Across the border in the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, a related Pima population had continued living on a traditional diet. Same ethnic background, same ancestral lineage, same genetic heritage, same thrifty genes inherited from the same ancient ancestors. They remained significantly leaner, They remained metabolically healthier. Their rates of obesity and diabetes were dramatically lower than their Arizona relatives. Same software, different inputs, completely different outputs. The thrifty gene is not a defect. It is not a mistake evolution made. It is a feature, an extraordinarily well-designed feature, that functioned perfectly for hundreds of thousands of years in the environment it was built for. It became a liability the instant that environment was replaced with something it was never designed to encounter. Now let's push the thought experiment into territory that doesn't get discussed enough, because we've established the fat storage biology and we've established that environment was the constraint. But here's a question worth taking seriously. Could an ancient human living in the ancient world, under the right conditions, ever have actually gotten fat? Not mildly overweight, actually fat. The answer is probably not to any clinically significant degree, but the reasoning behind that answer matters more than the answer itself. Not all ancient environments were equally scarce. Certain geographic situations created concentrated, temporary caloric abundance that was genuinely unusual by the standards of the ancient world. Coastal populations, riverine communities, groups living near reliable marine resources. These people had access to something that most ancient humans never experienced: seasonal flooding of food availability. Think about Pacific Northwest salmon runs. For a narrow window every year, rivers would become so dense with fish that the effort required to collect enormous quantities of calories dropped to almost nothing. A high-fat, high-protein food source, extraordinarily calorie-dense, available in staggering abundance for a few concentrated weeks. A population camped at the right river at the right time could potentially consume sustained caloric surpluses for an extended period in a way that was simply impossible for most hunter-gatherer groups in most environments. Under those very specific conditions, individuals could theoretically accumulate more stored body fat than was metabolically necessary. No bone changes consistent with the kind of systemic metabolic disease that obesity generates over decades. Then agriculture arrives approximately 10,000 years ago, and the skeletal record shifts with a speed that genuinely should disturb us more than it does. Average height drops measurably within just a few generations in populations that transition to grain-based diets. Bone density decreases, cavities appear with sudden and dramatic frequency. Markers of iron deficiency anemia show up in bone tissue in populations that previously showed none. Evidence of infectious disease increases as people crowd into permanent settlements. The irony embedded in all of this is almost too clean. Agriculture was the greatest organizational achievement in human history. It created surplus, it created predictability. It made cities possible, and cities made civilization possible. But the immediate physiological cost to the individual humans who made the transition was significant and measurable. A diet suddenly narrowed to whatever grain grew locally meant. Less nutritional variety than any hunter-gatherer had ever experienced, and for the first time in the entire history of the species, certain populations could exist in a state of prolonged caloric surplus. For the first time, scarcity was no longer enforcing the biological reset that had kept the thrifty gene from accumulating consequences. Agriculture didn't cause obesity immediately. The physical demands of early farming were still enormous, but it removed the constraint, it dismantled the ceiling, it created the conditions in which the thrifty gene, that ancient survival advantage, could eventually become the liability it is today. The first granary built 10,000 years ago was, in a very real biological sense, the first grocery store. We just needed another 10 millennia of food engineering to finish the job. And one more thing that deserves direct examination because it's the argument that comes up every single time this topic gets discussed. The exercise argument. Surely all that movement, all that hunting and foraging and walking and carrying provided some kind of structural protection. Surely the physical conditioning of the ancient lifestyle meant that even with the biology in place, obesity simply couldn't take hold because the body was too active to let it. The answer is partly yes and importantly no. Hunter-gatherers, including the Hadza today, do show higher muscle mass and lower body fat percentages than modern sedentary populations. That physical conditioning is real and it matters for a wide range of health outcomes. But recall what the actual calorie burn data showed. The movement isn't producing dramatically higher calorie expenditure. The Hadza aren't lean because they're burning thousands more calories than office workers. They're lean because they eat food that their biology can actually regulate. Unprocessed, varied, naturally satiating food with no engineered bliss points and no deliberate satiety suppression. If you gave the Hadza a Western diet tomorrow while they kept every element of their traditional physical lifestyle, the research strongly suggests they would gain weight. Because the variable that matters isn't the output side of the energy equation, it's the input side. Movement is genuinely valuable. The cardiovascular, hormonal, metabolic, and psychological benefits of physical activity are real and substantial and worth pursuing entirely independently of their effect on body weight. But movement is not the override switch that overrules a food environment specifically engineered to defeat your satiety biology. The wellness industry has spent decades and billions of dollars suggesting otherwise. The data does not support it. So let's actually answer the question: could ancient humans become obese? In their own environment, almost certainly not, but not because their biology was different, not because they had superior willpower or some ancestral discipline we've somehow lost along the way. The reason is far simpler and far more uncomfortable than that. The environment physically wouldn't allow it. Scarcity was the permanent default. Famine was the periodic enforcement. The only food that existed was real food, unprocessed, unengineered, food that worked with the body's satiety systems instead of being deliberately designed to bypass them. Their bodies were desperately trying to store fat every single day. Now take that exact same human, same bones, same brain, same hormones, same thrifty genes running the same ancient program, drop him into this world. The one with the delivery app that puts 4,000 calories at your door in 20 minutes. The one with products engineered in laboratories to find the precise combination of salt, fat, and sugar that keeps you eating past every signal your body sends to stop. The one with chronic psychological stress keeping hunger hormones elevated around the clock. He would not fare better than any modern person. He would fare worse. Because he would have zero cultural framework for navigating abundance, no concept of a serving size, no lived experience of a world where food ever required moderation. His brain encountering a drive-through menu for the first time would not see options. It would see the greatest caloric opportunity in the history of his species. Every ancient instinct firing in the same direction. Eat everything, store every calorie. Winter is always coming. Here's what this actually means. We are not descendants of ancient humans in some distant poetic sense. We are ancient humans. The metabolic architecture is identical. The hormonal systems are identical. The thrifty gene is running in your body right now with the same intensity it ran in theirs. Every time you can't stop after a few chips, that's not weakness. That's ancient biology meeting food engineered to defeat it. The ancient human didn't become obese because his world wouldn't let him. We built that world, and now we're living in the result.